because Codrington didn't just own people himself. When he died in 1710, he left his plantations and everyone on them to the Church of England. The church became one of the largest slave owners in the Caribbean, and they branded people with that word for decades. This is the story of how slavery funded one of Oxford's greatest libraries, and how the Church of England became a plantation owner. Christopher Codrington was born in the parish of St. John's, Barbados, not in England. He was born right there in the Caribbean, into a family that had been on the island for over 40 years. His grandfather, also named Christopher Codrington, had arrived in Barbados in 1627. This was early, just 5 years after the first English settlement on the island. At that time, Barbados was still developing. The economy was based on tobacco, cotton, and small-scale farming, with indentured servants from England. But everything was about to change. The grandfather married Frances Drax, sister of James Drax, and the Drax family would pioneer something that would transform the Caribbean forever: large-scale sugar production using enslaved African labor. By the 1640s and 1650s, Barbados had shifted from small farms to massive sugar plantations. Sugar was incredibly profitable in Europe. The demand was growing constantly. But sugar cultivation required intensive labor, far more than tobacco or cotton, more than could be sustained with indentured servants who worked for a set period and then gained their freedom. The solution, from the planter's perspective, was enslaved African labor. People who could be worked for life, whose children would be born into slavery, who had no legal rights or protections. By the 1660s, Barbados had been completely transformed. It had become one massive sugar-producing island, with enslaved Africans vastly outnumbering white colonists. The Codrington family was at the center of this transformation. The grandfather established 2 major plantations, Codringtons and Consets. These would remain in the family for generations, growing in size and profitability. Christopher Codrington II, our Christopher's father, expanded the family empire even further. He acquired more land, more enslaved people, more wealth. He became Captain General of the Leeward Islands, a powerful position governing multiple Caribbean colonies including Antigua, Nevis, St. Kitts, and Montserrat. He was one of the most powerful men in the British Caribbean. So when Christopher III was born in 1668, he was born into enormous wealth and privilege. He grew up on a sugar plantation, surrounded by enslaved people working in the fields, in the processing buildings, in his family's home. This was his normal. This was just how the world worked, as far as he knew. But unlike many plantation heirs who stayed in the Caribbean and became planters themselves, young Christopher was sent to England for education. At some point in his youth, probably around age 10 or 12, he left Barbados and traveled to England to attend school. First, he went to a school in Enfield, outside London. Then, in 1685, at age 17, he entered Christ Church, Oxford, one of the university's most prestigious colleges. This was the same year James II became King of England, the same James who was governor of the Royal African Company and had thousands of people branded with his initials. At Oxford, Christopher Codrington thrived. He was intellectually gifted, genuinely passionate about learning. He studied classics, theology, philosophy. He became known for his academic abilities and his love of books. He became part of an intellectual circle at Oxford that included some significant figures. Charles Boyle, who would become the 4th Earl of Orrery. Joseph Addison, who would become a famous essayist and politician. These were smart, educated, ambitious young men, and Codrington fit right in with them. In 1690, at age 22, Codrington achieved something rare and prestigious. He was elected Fellow of All Souls College. All Souls is unique at Oxford. It has no undergraduate students. It's essentially a society of scholars, and becoming a fellow was, and still is, extremely competitive. You had to be brilliant, well-connected, or both. Codrington was both. He had the intellectual credentials, and he had the wealth and family connections. As a Fellow of All Souls, he had access to the college's resources. He could live there. He could pursue his scholarly interests. And his great passion was collecting books. He became an obsessive book collector. This was during a period when book collecting was becoming fashionable among wealthy intellectuals. Codrington accumulated volumes on philosophy, theology, medicine, military history, classics. He bought books from all over Europe. By the time he died, he'd amassed a personal library of around 12,000 volumes, an enormous collection for the era. 12,000 books. To put that in perspective, many university libraries at the time had only a few thousand volumes total. Codrington's personal collection rivaled institutional libraries. He was spending vast amounts of money on this. Money that came from his family's plantations in Barbados. In 1693, when Codrington was 25, his scholarly life was interrupted. England and France were at war, the 9 Years' War, and the conflict extended to the Caribbean. The French held several islands, including Martinique. The English wanted to take them. Codrington returned to the Caribbean to participate in military operations. There was an attempted invasion of Martinique in 1693. It failed. The English forces, including Codrington, couldn't take the island. But Codrington gained military experience and established himself as someone willing to fight. After the Caribbean campaign, he went to Europe to continue his military career. He joined English forces fighting in Flanders, modern-day Belgium, and the Netherlands. In 1695, he fought with distinction at two major sieges, Huy and Namur. These were significant victories for the English and their allies. Codrington proved himself as a military officer. He was brave, competent, effective in combat. King William III, who was also fighting in these campaigns, took notice. The king gave Codrington a commission as captain in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, the elite Guards Regiment. This was both a real military position and a mark of royal favor. Under the system of double ranking used for Guards officers, Codrington also held the rank of lieutenant colonel in the regular army. So by his late 20s, Codrington had established himself as both a scholar and a soldier, the educated gentleman who could also command troops in battle, the intellectual who was also a man of action. This combination was considered ideal for someone of his class and background. In 1697, everything changed. His father, Christopher Codrington II, died. Christopher III inherited everything: the plantations in Barbados and Antigua, the enslaved people who worked them, the wealth accumulated over 2 generations. Suddenly, at age 29, he was one of the richest plantation owners in the Caribbean. And in 1698, just a year after his father's death, Christopher was appointed to his father's old position, Captain General of the Leeward Islands. He would govern Antigua, Nevis, St. Kitts, Montserrat, and surrounding territories. At age 30, he was running a colonial government while managing massive sugar plantations. Let's talk about what those plantations meant in detail, because understanding the reality of sugar production is crucial to understanding Codrington's wealth and what his bequest represented. The Codrington estates, Codringtons and Consets, were large operations in the parish of St. John's, Barbados. Historical records suggest they held at least 300 enslaved people, and possibly more than that at various times. The number fluctuated as people died and were replaced, as children were born, as people were bought or sold. But at any given time, hundreds of people were working these estates. These were sugar plantations, and sugar was the most brutal form of plantation agriculture in the Caribbean. More brutal than tobacco, more brutal than cotton, more brutal than coffee. Sugar production involved dangerous, exhausting, relentless work that killed people at horrific rates. Let me walk you through what sugar cultivation actually involved, because the specifics matter. First, there was the planting. Sugar cane has to be planted in rows, and the fields had to be prepared, cleared, tilled, made ready. This was hard physical labor in tropical heat and humidity. Workers used hoes and other hand tools to prepare the soil, plant the cane cuttings, and maintain the fields. The cane took about 12 to 18 months to mature. During that time, the fields had to be maintained. Weeds had to be cleared constantly. In the Caribbean climate, vegetation grows fast, and cane fields would be overrun if not constantly tended. Workers would spend long days bent over, using hoes to clear weeds between the rows of cane. Then came the harvest, and this is when the work became truly relentless. Sugar cane has to be harvested at the right time and processed quickly, or the sugar content drops and the juice spoils. During harvest season, typically several months of the year, work never stopped. It went around the clock in shifts. Cutting cane is backbreaking work. The cane grows 6 to 12 feet tall. It has to be cut by hand with machetes or cane knives. Workers would be in the fields from before dawn, bent over, swinging heavy blades, cutting cane stalks all day long. The work was exhausting. The tropical sun beat down. There was minimal water, minimal rest. People who couldn't keep up the pace faced punishment. After cutting, the cane had to be transported to the processing area immediately. Ox carts would carry loads of cut cane to the mill. More workers would unload and prepare it for processing. The processing was dangerous and brutal. The cane had to be crushed to extract the juice. This was done using mills, either animal-powered, oxen or horses turning a mechanism, or wind-powered. The cane would be fed between large rollers that crushed it. Workers doing this job faced constant danger. If you got your hand caught between the rollers while feeding in cane, the mill would crush your hand, your arm, potentially pulling your whole body in. Serious injuries and deaths from mill accidents were common. Plantation owners kept hatchets near the mills, not to stop the mills, but to quickly amputate a worker's arm if it got caught, trying to save the person's life, even if it meant losing the limb. The extracted juice then had to be boiled to produce sugar crystals. This happened in the boiling house, one of the most hellish places on any plantation. Large copper or iron kettles full of cane juice would be heated over fires. The juice had to be boiled for hours, carefully monitored, and transferred between kettles of different temperatures. The boiling house was incredibly hot. You're standing over fires in tropical heat, with steam and smoke everywhere. Workers could be burned by splashing hot sugar syrup, which would stick to skin and cause terrible burns. The work went on day and night during harvest season, with workers doing shifts around the clock. After boiling and cooling, the sugar crystals would be separated from molasses, packed into barrels, and prepared for shipping. Even this final stage involved hard physical labor, moving heavy barrels, preparing them for transport to the docks. The death rate on Caribbean sugar plantations was absolutely horrific. Multiple factors contributed to this. First, many newly arrived Africans died within the first 3 years of arrival, about 1/3, according to historical estimates. They died from the trauma of the Middle Passage, from being torn from their homes and families, from diseases they had no immunity to, tropical fevers, dysentery, other illnesses, from the shock of plantation conditions, from despair and depression that made them vulnerable to illness. Then there were work-related deaths, accidents in the mills and boiling houses, heat exhaustion and dehydration, infections from minor wounds that became serious in the tropical climate, malnutrition. Enslaved people were typically given minimal rations, just enough to keep them working, but not enough to maintain long-term health. The brutality of the overseers also killed people. Whippings that went too far. People put in stocks or chains in the tropical heat with no shade or water. Punishments that were designed to terrify others, but sometimes killed the person being punished. And then there was just the grinding exhaustion. Bodies broke down under the relentless work. People developed chronic conditions. They aged prematurely. They died young. This meant that plantations couldn't sustain their enslaved populations through natural reproduction. People died faster than children were born. Plantation owners calculated this into their business model. They needed a constant supply of new enslaved people from the Atlantic slave trade just to maintain their workforce numbers. It was literally a work-to-death system, where the assumption was that people would be worked until they died and replaced with newly purchased people. Christopher Codrington knew all of this. He'd grown up on a Barbados sugar plantation. He'd seen this system operating from childhood. He knew what happened in the cane fields and the boiling houses. He knew about the death rates. He knew about the constant need to buy new people to replace those who died. This wasn't abstract or hidden from him. It was the foundation of his family's wealth. And there's one practice from the Codrington plantations that historians always mention, because it so viscerally symbolizes the dehumanization at the heart of slavery, the branding. For about a decade, newly arrived enslaved people were branded with a hot iron, not just once by the traders who'd transported them from Africa. That was standard practice throughout the slave trade, marking cargo for identification. But a second time, with the plantation owner's mark. On the Codrington plantations, people were branded with the word society burned into their chests. Let me be clear about what this meant physically. An iron brand would be heated in a fire until it glowed red or white hot. The person would be held down, probably by multiple people because the instinct would be to resist. Then the hot iron would be pressed firmly against their chest for several seconds, long enough to burn through the outer layers of skin and create a permanent scar. The pain was intense and immediate. Burning flesh creates not just physical agony, but also a smell, a sound, a trauma that would be remembered forever. The wound would take weeks to heal, vulnerable to infection in the tropical climate. Even after healing, the scar remained, raised tissue in the shape of letters spelling out Society. Each letter distinct, each letter a permanent mark. Why society? Because that's what Codrington's will specified. He was leaving these plantations, and everyone on them, to the society for the propagation of the gospel. The enslaved people were going to become property of the church's missionary organization, so they were marked as such, branded with the word that would identify their future owner. The branding wasn't continuous official policy for the entire history of the plantations. It was particularly the practice of one overseer and happened for roughly a decade, But while it lasted, it affected dozens, if not hundreds, of people. And those brands lasted for life. Think about what it meant to carry that mark. Every day, you'd look down at your own chest and see that word burned into your skin. You couldn't forget what had been done to you, because the evidence was permanently inscribed on your body. Every time you bathed, every time you dressed, every time someone looked at you, that brand was visible. It marked you as property. It marked you as belonging to society, to an institution, not even to an individual person, but to an organization. Other enslaved people would see it and know you'd come through the Codrington plantations. Overseers would see it. Potential buyers, if you were ever sold, would see it. Your children would see their parent marked this way. You would carry that brand to your grave. The practice of branding enslaved people was common throughout Caribbean and American slavery, but it was always controversial, even among slave owners. Some argued it was necessary for identification and to prevent escapes. Others argued it was unnecessarily cruel and damaged the property. This was their concern, not the human suffering, but the economic cost of injuring valuable workers. The fact that the Codrington plantations branded people with society, marking them as belonging to what would become a church organization, adds a particular layer of irony and horror. The church that preached about human dignity and the soul's value was literally branding people like cattle. The missionary society that claimed to be saving souls was burning ownership marks into flesh. As Captain General, Codrington had significant power, but his time in office was turbulent. He got into bitter disputes with other colonial officials and planters. Some accused him of using his political position to seize land illegally. During the constant wars with France, territories changed hands frequently, and property rights became confused. Codrington allegedly took advantage of this chaos to grab plantations for himself or his allies. His enemies were powerful people. William Meade, the Commissioner of Customs and a counselor for Nevis and St. Kitts, opposed him. James Norton, the Lieutenant Governor of St. Kitts, became a bitter enemy. Codrington eventually had him removed from office, which only intensified the conflict. These disputes got nasty. Ironically, some white planters used the language of slavery to complain about Codrington, claiming he was treating them like slaves with his arbitrary exercise of power. The fact that these men owned actual enslaved people and were complaining about being metaphorically enslaved apparently didn't strike them as hypocritical. Codrington also faced accusations of illegal trade and smuggling. As Captain General, he was supposed to enforce trade regulations, but he had financial interests that conflicted with those regulations. His critics accused him of using his office for personal profit, of looking the other way when it benefited him, of being corrupt. In 1703, while still serving as Captain General, Codrington wrote his will. He was only 35 years old, but he wanted his affairs in order. Maybe he anticipated that his conflicts with other colonists could turn violent. Maybe he was just being prudent. Either way, the will he wrote in 1703 would shape his legacy for centuries. The will had several major bequests. He left £1,500 for a monument to his father in Westminster Abbey in London. That monument was eventually built, honoring Christopher Codrington II. He left money and books to All Souls College, Oxford, his old college where he'd been a fellow. Specifically, £10,000 in cash for building a new library, his personal collection of approximately 12,000 books, and another £4,000 to be spent on purchasing additional books for the library. This was an enormous bequest. £10,000 in 1703 was a massive sum, equivalent to millions in today's money. Combined with the books and the additional book-buying fund, Codrington was giving All Souls the resources to build one of the great libraries of England. But there was another bequest, and this one is even more significant historically. Codrington left his Barbados plantations, both Codrington's and Concett's estates, to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, or SPG for short. The SPG was the Church of England's missionary organization, founded in 1701, just 2 years before Codrington wrote his will. Its purpose was to spread Anglican Christianity to the colonies and to indigenous peoples. It sent missionaries, established churches, and promoted religious education in British territories around the world. Codrington's bequest to the SPG came with specific instructions. The plantation should be used to fund the establishment of a college in Barbados. This college should teach medicine and surgery as well as theology. His idea was that missionaries who could provide medical care would be welcomed by the population, and this would give them opportunities to evangelize. He wrote that they could do good to men's souls whilst they are taking care of their bodies. He also specified that the plantation should be continued entire, kept operating as plantations, and he stated that 300 Negroes at least always kept thereon to maintain the estate's productivity and profitability. The college would be funded by the profits from sugar production using enslaved labor, and he requested, though didn't strictly require, that a portion of the funds be used to educate the enslaved population on the plantations. So here's what Codrington's will meant in practice. The Church of England would inherit 2 major sugar plantations. The church would own hundreds of enslaved people. The church would operate these plantations for profit, and that profit would fund missionary work and theological education. The enslaved people who'd been branded with society on Codrington's plantations, that's why. They were going to become property of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The church's missionary society would literally own them. Codrington died on April 7, 1710, at age 41 or 42. He'd been ill for some time, possibly from tropical diseases that were common in the Caribbean, and often killed Europeans even when they'd lived there for years. His death came relatively young, but he'd accomplished a lot in his short life. Military service, colonial governorship, vast wealth accumulation, and bequests that would shape institutions for centuries. His body was brought back to England and buried in All Souls Chapel on June 19, 1710. His tomb is still there today. When his estate was calculated, his total wealth exceeded £80,000, an absolutely enormous fortune in 1710. To give you a sense of scale, a skilled craftsman at the time might earn £30 to £50 per year. Codrington's wealth was equivalent to over 1,500 years of a skilled worker's wages. In modern terms, we're talking about a fortune worth tens of millions of pounds, possibly over £100 million. Where did that wealth come from? Sugar. Enslaved labor. The 2 Barbados plantations that had been producing sugar for decades, worked by hundreds of people who had no choice, who were property, who were worked until they died and replaced by new people bought from the slave trade. All Souls College received their bequest and immediately began planning. They commissioned Nicholas Hawksmoor, one of England's greatest architects. He'd worked with Sir Christopher Wren on St. Paul's Cathedral and other major buildings. Hawksmoor designed a magnificent library for All Souls. Construction began in 1716 and the building was completed in 1720. But it took another 30 years, until 1751, for the interior to be fully furnished and ready to house books. The result was stunning. High ceilings with perfect proportions, large windows providing natural light, beautiful architectural details, one of the finest library spaces in England. Codrington's 12,000 books were installed. The £4,000 was spent buying more books. Over time, All Souls continued adding to the collection, and it became one of Oxford's great research libraries. For the next 300 years, it was known as the Codrington Library. Students and scholars used this library for centuries. They studied in a space built with plantation wealth. They read books purchased with money from enslaved labor. For most of that time, this history wasn't emphasized or even much discussed. Codrington was remembered simply as a generous benefactor, a book-loving fellow who'd left his collection and money to his old college. A statue of Codrington by the sculptor Sir Henry Cheer was placed in the center of the library. Students walking through would pass his statue, studying in a space that bore his name, using resources he'd provided. For 300 years, he was honored this way. Meanwhile, in Barbados, the other bequest was being implemented, though much more slowly and problematically. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel took ownership of the Codrington plantations in 1710. They now owned Codrington's and Concett's estates. They now owned over 300 enslaved people. The Church of England was officially in the sugar plantation business. And they ran those plantations for profit. That's what Codrington's will had specified. The plantations should be continued entire, operated as going concerns, generating income, and the SPG needed that income to fund their missionary work around the world and to eventually build the college in Barbados. So the enslaved people continued to work the fields, continued to cut cane in the tropical heat, continued to face brutal conditions, long hours, dangerous work, continued to die at horrific rates and be replaced by people purchased from the slave trade. Now they were branded with society instead of a private owner's mark, but they were still enslaved, still property, still subjected to whipping, chains, and all the mechanisms of control that plantation slavery required. The SPG justified this by arguing that they were Christianizing the enslaved people. They provided some religious instruction. They baptized people. They argued that bringing enslaved people to Christianity made their bondage more bearable, gave them spiritual comfort even in physical bondage, prepared their souls for salvation even if their bodies remained in chains. This rationalization allowed educated religious men to own people without seeing a moral contradiction. They convinced themselves that enslaving people while converting them to Christianity was actually doing God's work. The enslaved people gained eternal salvation, in theory, which was more important than temporal freedom in their twisted logic. But in practice, conditions on the SPG's Codrington plantations were about the same as on other sugar plantations. There's no evidence that enslaved people were treated significantly better because they were owned by the church rather than private planters. They worked just as hard. They died just as frequently. The sugar produced was just as profitable. For decades, actually for over a century, the Church of England operated these plantations. Missionaries sent to Africa, Asia, and the Americas were funded by this sugar. Churches built in the colonies were funded this way. The entire missionary enterprise of the church was partly financed by the profits from enslaved labor on plantations the church directly owned. Various church officials justified this over the years. Some argued that slavery was part of God's plan. Some said that Africans were better off enslaved and Christianized than free in Africa. Some claimed the enslaved people on church plantations were fortunate to have such benevolent Christian owners. The rationalizations were elaborate and, to our modern eyes, obviously self-serving. It wasn't until the 1780s that anyone within the church hierarchy seriously challenged this. In 1783, Bishop Bealby Porteus, himself the son of a Virginia planter, preached a sermon at St. Mary Le Bow in London for the SPG's anniversary. He criticized the society's ownership of enslaved people and called for better treatment and eventual emancipation. This was revolutionary for the time. Porteus was saying out loud what few in the church establishment wanted to hear, that owning people was wrong, that the church shouldn't be doing it, that Christianity and slavery were incompatible. But change was still slow, very slow. The SPG continued operating the plantations profitably for decades more. Finally, in 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which ended slavery throughout British colonies. When emancipation came, the British government compensated slave owners for their loss of property. The SPG received 8,823 8 shillings 9 pence in compensation for 411 enslaved people on the Codrington plantations. The church was paid for losing its human property. The formerly enslaved people themselves received nothing. Think about that. 411 people gained their freedom, and the church was compensated for no longer being able to own them. The injustice is staggering. As for Codrington College, the educational institution Codrington had envisioned in his will, it was finally built, but it took over 30 years. Construction ran from 1714 to 1742. And despite Codrington's vision of educating the enslaved population, the college was initially confined to white students only. The other planters in Barbados had objected strongly to educating enslaved people. They feared that education would make people harder to control, would give them ideas about freedom and rights. So that part of Codrington's plan was effectively blocked. The college eventually opened as a theological seminary, training white men for the Anglican ministry. It continues operating today as Codrington College, a seminary for the church in the province of the West Indies. It's a functioning educational institution, though its founding and funding were inextricably tied to plantation slavery. For almost 300 years, this history was minimized or ignored. The Codrington Library was celebrated for its architecture and its collections. Codrington himself was remembered as a generous benefactor, a scholar, a book lover. The fact that his wealth came from enslaving people wasn't emphasized in the library itself or in most discussions of All Souls history. But starting in the 2000s, students and activists began pushing for institutions to acknowledge and address this history more honestly. The Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015 to 2016, which called for the removal of a statue of Cecil Rhodes from Oriel College, Oxford, sparked broader conversations about colonial legacies at Oxford and other British universities. All Souls started facing questions about the Codrington Library and the statue. Students pointed out that the library honored a slave owner, that the space had been built with plantation wealth, that for 300 years the source of that wealth had been downplayed or ignored. In 2018, All Souls put up a memorial plaque at the entrance to the library. It reads, "In memory of those who worked in slavery, on the Codrington plantations in the West Indies. It was a first acknowledgement, literally carved in stone, that the library's founding was tied to enslaved people's labor. In 2020, All Souls made a more significant decision. The college announced they would stop calling it the Codrington Library. After 300 years, they removed his name. It's now just the All Souls Library, or the College Library. The name change was meant to make clear that the college doesn't want to honor a slave owner, even if his bequest funded the building. At the same time, All Souls committed money to address the legacy. They pledged £100,000 to Codrington College in Barbados. Later, they increased this to £1 million over 10 years for Oxford University's Black Academic Futures program, supporting black graduate students. They also established 3 fully funded graduate studentships at Oxford specifically for Caribbean students. These are named after Sir Hugh Springer, who was a visiting fellow of All Souls in 1962 to 1963, and later became Governor General of Barbados. £6 million of the college's endowment was set aside permanently to fund these studentships, but the college decided to keep Codrington's statue in the library. This was controversial. Some argued the statue honors a slave owner and should be removed. Others argued it should stay as part of telling the history honestly. The compromise All Souls reached. The statue remains, but it's contextualized. Names of enslaved people who worked on the Codrington plantations and adjacent estates are projected onto the statue, literally inscribing their names onto his image. Digital displays in the library's anteroom explain the full history of Codrington, the plantations, and the founding of the library. This approach, retain and explain, has its supporters and critics. Supporters say it's important not to erase history, that the statue can be educational if properly contextualized. Critics say the statue still honors a slave owner in a place of prominence, that projection and plaques aren't enough, that it should be removed and placed in a museum with full historical context. In 2020, a student named Oluwafemi Nylander protested outside All Souls. He stood shirtless with a chain around his neck and the words All Slaves College painted in red on his chest. He was deliberately echoing how enslaved people on Codrington's plantations had been branded with society on their chests. His protest powerfully connected past and present, showing that this history still matters, still has emotional weight. The Church of England has also grappled with this legacy. In 2006, the General Synod, the Church's governing body, formally expressed deep sorrow for the Church's involvement in slavery. They acknowledged that the Church had owned enslaved people through the SPG's plantations, that this was wrong, that it caused immense suffering. The SPG's successor organization, now called the United Society Partners in the Gospel, USPG, has committed money to work in Barbados. They've pledged 18 million Barbadian dollars, about £7 million, to be spent over 10 to 15 years supporting educational and development work in partnership with the Codrington Trust in Barbados. But there's been no formal apology from the Church of England to the descendants of enslaved people. No reparations proportionate to the profits the Church made from plantation slavery for over a century. The acknowledgments of wrongdoing have been real, but the concrete actions to address lasting inequalities remain debated as insufficient by many. Christopher Codrington died 314 years ago. The library he funded has educated thousands of scholars. The books he donated have been used by countless students. His legacy in terms of learning and scholarship is real and significant. But so is his legacy of slavery. The hundreds of people who worked and died on his plantations, the people branded with society on their chests, the system he perpetuated and profited from, the wealth built on their forced labor. Both things are true simultaneously. He was genuinely intellectual, genuinely passionate about books and learning, and he was a plantation owner who enslaved hundreds of people and thought nothing of leaving them as property to the church when he died. Over 300 enslaved people worked the Codrington plantations at any given time during the decades the SPG owned them. Over the century plus of church ownership, thousands of people passed through those plantations, living, working, dying, being replaced. Each one was a person with a name, though we only know a fraction of those names. Each one had hopes and dreams that were crushed by the system that enslaved them. Understanding Codrington's story matters because it shows how slavery was woven into the fabric of British institutions at every level. Not just private merchants or trading companies, but Oxford University, the Church of England, respectable, prestigious institutions that still exist today. The wealth from slavery didn't just benefit individual slave owners. It spread through British society, funding libraries, colleges, churches, missionary work, education, culture. The beauty of the All Souls Library, the value of its collections, the scholarship it has enabled, all of this was built on plantation slavery. That's an uncomfortable truth. It complicates how we think about these institutions and their histories. It means acknowledging that institutions we respect have complicated, morally compromised foundations. It means grappling with the fact that learning and brutality, scholarship and slavery, Christianity and human bondage were all entangled in ways that were accepted and normalized for centuries. All Souls College and the Church of England are trying now, imperfectly, with ongoing debate about whether their efforts are adequate, to face this history honestly, to acknowledge it, to memorialize the enslaved people, to direct money toward addressing ongoing inequalities that have roots in slavery. Is it enough? That's debated. Can institutions ever truly make amends for profits built on slavery centuries ago? How do you quantify that or make it right? These are difficult questions with no easy answers. But the first step is honesty, telling the full story, not hiding the uncomfortable parts, not celebrating Codrington as a generous benefactor without also acknowledging he was a slave owner, not admiring the library's beauty without recognizing it was built with plantation wealth. Christopher Codrington, 1668 to 1710. Scholar, soldier, governor, plantation owner, book collector, slave owner. A complex figure who loved learning and owned people, who wanted to fund education and left enslaved people as property to the church, who built a magnificent library and branded people with a hot iron. The library still stands, beautiful, useful, full of books and scholars, but now with a plaque acknowledging the enslaved people whose labor funded it, with a statue that has their names projected onto it, with the history being told more fully than it was for 3 centuries. That's progress. Slow, incomplete, debated progress, but progress nonetheless. That's the story of Christopher Codrington and the library built with plantation wealth. A story about how slavery funded scholarship, how the church owned souls along with plantations, how beauty and brutality were built on the same foundation. A story we're still learning how to tell honestly, and still figuring out how to address meaningfully more than 300 years later.